guys, and welcome back to my video. So in this video we are going to write the logic for the authentication service using Firebase. So the first thing is you need to create a folder called services, and then we create a file called auth service.dat, and then we create a class named auth service. And then the first thing that we need to do is we need to initialize Firebase auth. So just click Firebase auth, and then this goes to Firebase auth.instance. So, and then the next thing is we need to create a stream for the Firebase users. And then it's going to be a get, and then we say auth state change. Which is our Firebase auth auth state changes. So okay, this, so users can be now, so this is supposed to be null. So what this line of code does is it's going to listen to the stream of the users class in our Firebase class. So, and then it's going to monitor if there are any auth state changes. So it's that if a user is logged in or is not logged in or is logged out, so this function, this line of code is just going to monitor that. And then the next thing that we need to do is we need to create a function of type future. So future functions are functions for asynchronous activities. For example, activities that we do not know when they are going to happen. We just know that they will happen in the future. So this function, we are going to call it sign in with email and password. So the first thing is going to have a string. We are going an email, and then we are going to pass in a password. And also we are also going to pass in the build context as a parameter. So since this is an asynchronous activity, we need to use the async keyword. And then the first thing is we need to create a try catch block. So we are first going to try to catch, and then we are going to await the Firebase, and then we are going to sign in our user with email and password. And then for the email, we are going to pass in the email string parameter, and also for the password, we are going to pass in the password string parameter. And also we also need to catch if there are exceptions, that is, if there is any problem with connection to Firebase, we will need to catch those exceptions. So we are just going to say Firebase auth exception, Firebase auth exception, which is we are going to catch the exception Then if there is an exception, we are going to display a dialog. And then the context, we are going to pass in the context. And then in the builder, we are going to pass in context function, and also it's going to return an alert dialog. And then for the title, we are just going to pass in text, and then the text will be error occurred. And then for the content, we are also passing in the type of exception from Firebase. And then we also need to counter for the user's action. So we are going to return a text pattern. So if that button is pressed, we are just going to say navigator.pop, which is just going to return to the widget in which the user tapped the text button. And then for the child, we are just going into display text and say OK. So now that we are done with the sign in with email and password, we also need to create we also need to create the sign up with email and password. And then of type void. So since this is also an asynchronous activity, you're also going to use the async function. And then to create our new user in our Firebase, we use Firebase create user with email and password, and we also need to catch exceptions if there are any exception. Firebase auth exception, and then we are going to catch the exception. And then for the content, we are just going to display the exception from Firebase. And then we need to account for the user's action. Okay. And then we are left with one more function, which is the sign out function. We are left with, we have another exception that we need to catch. Say, so we're saying that if e is equals to email already in use, then we are going to show this. Let's just copy this alert dialog. Let's just say show dialog, and then for that we'll just say error occurred. And then for the content, let's give it a text of email already in use. And then let's account for the user's actions, and then let's just show him a text button on praised, and then we're just going to say navigator.pop. And then here we're just going to say text. Then it's just going to say okay. And then else, if there is another error that we do not know, let's just copy this. Then let's paste it, and then let's just say error, and then $e. Okay, and then we are left with one more function, which is the sign out. So we're just going to create a function of future type of void. That means that our function does not return anything, and then we are going to say sign out. And then await. So this is supposed to be an async function. Firebase auth dot sign out. Okay, so now we are done with our auth service for our authentication. So the first thing we did is we initiated Firebase, and then we created a stream that is going to listen if there are any auth state changes in Firebase. That means if our user is signed in, if he's not signed in, or if he's logged out. And then we created another function which is sign in with email and password that takes in the email string, password string, and also a build context. And then we are going to try to sign in our user with an email and also in password. If that doesn't go well, if there is an exception, we are just going to display an alert dialog showing that there is an exception. Then this exception is going to come from Firebase. The same thing with our sign up with email and password. We are going to sign up our user with an email and then password, and then if there is any error, we are going to display the exception. If the account already in use, we are going to show an exception to the user that the account is already in use. And then lastly, we created our sign out function that is going to sign out our user from our application. And then the next thing that we need to do is we need to create our auth providers. So let's go there, and then let's create auth provider. It's a auth provider dot dat. So what this auth provider will do is that it will allow us to access our auth service from any widget in our application, right? So we'll be using Riverpod as a state management for accessing the auth service. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to create an auth provider, which is of type provider, and is going to take in our auth service class, and then it's going to have a reference. So we need to import this provider from Riverpod. As you can see, we now have Riverpod. So this our auth provider is going to return the auth service class, right? It's going to return the auth service class, and then we are also going to have another provider that we are going to say auth state provider. So what this provider will do is it will listen to any authentication state changes in our application. So it's going to be a type of stream. It's going to be a type of stream provider, and then it's going to listen to the user. It's going to listen to the users from Firebase, right? And then it's going to take in a reference as a parameter, which we'll use to access, which Flutter widgets we'll use to access information to read information from the stream provider, right? So we are going to return reference. So as you can see, reference.read, that means that it's going to read from auth provider and then .auth state changes. So what this provider will do is that it's going to take in a stream of provider, a type of user or user from Firebase, right? Which can be null. We can have sometimes our application will not have any user, right? And then we have the reference, which will be used to read any providers from Firebase. In this case, we are reading our authentication provider, and then from our authentication provider, we are going to we are going to read the auth state change. As you can see, we are going to read the auth state change. As you can remember, this auth state change that monitors if our user is signed in or he's signed out, right? So we need we created the auth state provider so that we can access the state of the user from anywhere in our application. That is, if our user is logged in or is logged out, we want to access that from anywhere in our application, right? So the next thing that we are going to do is now we are going to move on to the layout. So on the layout, if on the pages, we are going to create a page called auth checker. Auth checker dot. So this is going to be a stateless widget, and then we are going to say auth checker. And then what we need to do is if we want to consume or if we want to read data from our providers in Riverpod, we change this this stateless widget to consumer widget, since we want to consume the data from our Riverpod providers, right? And then we need to remove this constant and then the next thing that we need to do is we need to pass in the widget reference, which is widget reference ref. So this will allow us to watch or read any provider, right? So now the first thing that we need to do is we need to initialize our provider. We're going to say auth state is equals to reference dot watch. So we are going to watch our auth state provider. So if you remember from our providers, we have this auth state provider that we are going to watch it. So if there are any changes, they are going to be updated since we are watching this auth state provider, right? So now we remove this container, and then we are going to return auth state dot made a typo. We are going to return auth state dot when, and then for the data we are going to say data we're going to say data, and then we're saying if data is not equal to now. That means that if our user is not signed out, or if our user is not signed out, right, or if our user data is not equal to now, that means that if our user is signed in, right, we are going to return the home page, right? We are going to return the home page. So let's import it. We are going to import the home page, else we are going to return the sign in page. That means that if they are not signed in, we are going to return them to the sign in page. And then for the error, we need to create the error screen, right? We need to create the error screen. So just go and say error screen dot dat, and then it's going to be a stateless widget. So we we need to import the material.dat, and then we need to pass in an object e, and then we need to pass in also stack trace, which can be now. Then we can say trace, and then we need to pass in these variables in our constructor. So this dot e, then this dot trace. And then we need to return a scaffold. And then the body is going to be a column. So I'm going to have the main axis alignment dot center. And then children, and then we are going to display a text of e.toString, and then another text of trace.toString. So here we need to pass in the required parameter. Okay, so let's go back to our auth checker. Let's go back to our auth checker page, and then on this area we are going to pass in a function that's going to take in the e and then the trace, and then it's going to return our error screen. It's going to return our error screen, and then the e, going to pass in the e, and then trace, we are going to pass in the trace. Okay, and then we are left with the loading part. So now we need to go back to our pages and then create the loading screen. Loading screen .dat. And then we need it to be also a stateless widget, and then we are just going to say loading screen. And then we are going to import the material.dat file. And then on the loading screen we are just going to return a scaffold. And then in the body we are just going to return a center widget with a child of a secular progress bar, secular progress indicator. Okay, so let's add a constant modifier. Okay, so now let's go back to our application, to our auth checker file, and then on the loading we are just going to return the loading screen. Sorry, just going to return the loading screen. Okay, so now let's go into our main.dat file. We still have an error. Okay, Okay, now we are done with our auth checker file, our auth checker widget. So what this auth checker does is we say it's going to use the consumer widget, which is from Riverpod, and then also it's going to have this widget reference that allows us to watch the auth state provider that is in our providers, this auth state provider. So, and then we are going to return the data in the auth state provider. So if our data in the auth state provider, that means that if the state of our auth state provider, that means that if our user is not equal to, if our user is logged in, if they are logged in, we are going to return them to the home screen. If they are not, we are going to return them to the sign in screen. If there is an error, we are going to display it using our error screen. And then if our application is still loading, we are going to just use the loading screen to show our secular progress indicator, right? And then let's move on to the main.dat file. In the main.dat file, what we need to do is in this my app, we need to wrap this widget. We need to wrap this widget with a provider scope from Riverpod. The provider scope. So what this provider scope does is that it allows us to access it allows our widgets to access data from anywhere in our application. So if you remember, using Flutter is a list of widgets. So if the data needs to be passed, it needs to be passed from the parent widget to the child widgets. That means that if we have a lot of widgets, this is going to strain our application, and it's going to make it slow. So what Riverpod does is allows our child widgets to be able to access data directly without them passing through the parents widget. So that's what this provider scope does. And then the next thing that we are going to do is we are going to initialize Firebase. So we have created another provider in our main.dat file. This provider is a type of future provider that is going to listen to the Firebase app, which represents a single Firebase app instance, and then it's going to return an initialization of our Firebase application, right? So inside our my app widget, we are going to change this to consumer widget. And then if you still remember, we need to pass in the widget reference here. So what this widget reference does, it will allow us to initialize to read our Firebase initializer provider. And then inside this home we are going to return initialize provider dot when, and then if there's data, that means that if our Firebase app is initialized, we are going to return the auth checker, which is going to check if our user is signed in or not, if you still remember. And then let's import the auth checker class. And then if there is an error, so if there is an error, we are just going to return our error class. We're going to return the error screen, which is going to take in E as E, trace as tech trace. And then we also have the loading part, which is going just to return our loading screen. So so it seems as if there is an error. Okay, let's see. So initialize dot when, and then we have the data. And then we are going to have loading. Okay, so there seems to be an error. I don't know. We need to remove this constant. Okay. Then we need to import this state change class. Okay. So we are done with main.dat file. So what we are doing is we are creating an Firebase initializer that is going to initialize our instance of our Firebase application. So to monitor that we created this provider, and then we then access this provider using the ref.watch method, and then we then initialize it. If our application is already initialized, then we are going to return the auth checker, which is going to check if our user is authenticated or not. If there is an error, we are going to display that error using the error screen. If it's still loading, we are going to show a circular progress bar. So now that our application is done, let's try to debug it. Okay, my app is not okay, let's try to run it. Okay, so I'm waiting for the application to load, so I'll be back once. Okay, now the next thing that we need to do is we need to go in our sign in.dat file that we created last week, and then we'll go to our elevated button, and then inside our elevated button, so the first thing that we need to do is we need to initialize our auth service class, or the service auth services custom. So we need to import this class. So now let's go on to our elevated button that we created. So now we need to do is auth service dot, and then we are just going to sign in email with email and password. So which is going to be email dot trim, and then here we're also going to do the same for the password dot trim. And then we need also to go in our register page. So let's first initialize our auth service class. And then let's go to our radio button, and then on the onPressed method, let's just say auth okay, sorry, auth service dot sign up with email and password. So here we're just going to say email what did we call these variables? Okay, email dot trim, and then the password dot trim. Okay, Okay, now that our application is done, let's reload our application. And then let's try to register. Okay guys, so since we didn't get a response when the user registers, so I've used this navigator.push, which is going to redirect the user to the sign in page once they are registered on Firebase, right? So let's try to register our user. And then let's see, as you can see, and then let's try to log in. So okay, what we want to do is let's copy this, and then let's go to our sign in page, and then in our sign in.dat file, and then we want to make sure, so let's first copy this navigator.push method, and then let's paste it in our on pressed, and then let's change this to home. So we want to make sure that once they are signed in, we want to redirect them to the home page. Yeah, let's reload our application. And then let's try to log in. And then as you can see, now we are now on the home page. That means that our user was signed in successfully. And then if we go back to our Firebase, you can see we now have itempo at software.com. Let's try to close this application. Let's close it, and then let's try to open it again, and let's see what happens. And then as you can see, since we are already signed in, our app just directs us to the home page, right? So thank you for watching, guys. If you found this video useful, make sure you don't forget to click on the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell on.